Earlier we were talking about modern traditionalism and my obsession with stars, and we're going to talk a little bit more about half square triangles, which are really the building block of so many quilting blocks in the world. Whether they're historical, modern, you name it, there's likely a half square triangle or 7 in there somewhere. Half square triangles are one of the most popular building blocks in quilting, and for a lot of people they're the bane of their quilting lives. They can be fiddly, they can be a challenge, or they can be joyful. In these particular quilting blocks that we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about how to make them with as little pain as possible. This particular quilting block, for example, we started with a carpenter star block. It's one of my favorite quilting blocks. If I could marry a quilt block, it would likely be a carpenter star block. I love the central star in a carpenter star. I love the frame that goes around a carpenter star. And I almost, to some extent, love the two-colorness of a star. But for me, color is really where it's at in quilt blocks. So one of the things I really wanted to do in updating a carpenter star was infuse more color into it. So when I thought about modernizing the carpenter star, color was the first thing that I went to. The second thing I went to is scale. So if you start looking at my example here of my updated carpenter star, or my mashup, if you will, one of the first things you'll notice is that my sections or my blocks or my units are much, much larger. Whereas these smaller units are 2.5 inches or 2 inches finished, these are more like 4.5 or 4 inches finished. Much, much larger. I love to play with larger scales. They're so much more forgiving, especially when you're thinking about half square triangles. So much easier to trim up a 4.5 inch half square triangle than one of those fiddly 2.5 inch guys. You'll also see there's a lot more color, but you'll also see it's not quite as familiar looking. The center of this particular quilt, for example, does not have that pinwheel effect that you see in every carpenter star. Rather, what you see is a Cheyenne block. Cheyenne blocks are super simple. They're super fun. They're built of simple squares and half square triangles, and they're another one of my favorite traditional blocks. So what I did is I actually inserted a Cheyenne block into the center of my carpenter star, and that's why I'm calling it kind of a mashup, if you will. Combining those two traditional blocks to create something new and different that really kind of sings to my heart and really makes me as a quilter a happy girl. You'll also see there's a good bit of variety of color throughout, and that larger scale as well, and some interesting placement of negative space throughout. So let's go ahead and talk about building some half square triangles. If you happen to have access to an electronic cutter, it can be a handy tool to utilize for half square triangles because you can actually cut multiple pieces to build half square triangles super accurately and super quickly. I happen to have one right here that I'm going to go ahead and utilize to make a bunch of half square triangle pieces that I can sew together quickly. So first what I'm going to do, I've already loaded the size that I want to cut and the shape that I want to cut, including the seam allowance, so that I've got that included. That's real important to remember with your electronic cutter. I'm just going to go ahead and tap the cut button and the start button and let the cutter go ahead and go to work. Now granted, yes, I could do this with a rotary cutter and a ruler, but an electronic cutter is going to be a lot more accurate. It's also going to be a lot faster. I could be doing something else while the cutter does this for me. I could be ironing other fabrics. I could be queuing up my next choice on Netflix while I'm sewing. I could be doing a whole lot of things. I could be taking a look at my other fabric that I just went ahead and let the electronic cutter cut and pulling up my fabrics. So for example, once the cutter pulls or sets the fabric out, I can just go ahead and pull my fabric up and it's all ready to go for me. It's very easy to go ahead and pull these guys up. There's even a handy tool that you can utilize to do that, but I like to use my fingers because I keep my fingernails trimmed so that I can use them for this kind of thing and for finger pressing. And they come out just ready to go. Also, you'll notice that the edges are nice and trimmed so that I won't have any dog ears when I sew these guys together. So let's go ahead and pull this out of the machine after we hit the magical OK button and tell it that we're all done. Let's go ahead and grab this little yellow triangle just to get us started. Here we go. So that we can pair these two guys together and sew them together, which is really just like sewing any pair of triangles together. It's not rocket science or anything of the sort. We'll just pair these guys right sides together over at the sewing machine. So let's go. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and sew these guys together with a traditional 1/4 inch seam, back stitching, of course, at the end and the beginning of the seam. We can go ahead and press it to make it be finished. Now, not everybody has access to an electronic cutting machine. A lot of us just have rotary cutters and such at home, so there's another way. There's always another way. You can actually just utilize a pencil and go ahead and pair up two simple squares that are matching in size and draw two simple diagonal lines on the wrong side of such a pair of squares. It can be the light side or the dark side, doesn't really matter. And this is going to go ahead and yield a total of 8 half square triangles. Let's go ahead and sew these guys together. What we're going to do here is we're going to actually sew a 1/4 inch seam on parallel sides of each of these lines. So we're going to be sewing a total of 4 seams. Back stitching at both ends. If you've ever sewn two half square triangles at once, this may feel kind of familiar. This is taking that method of half square triangles and really just kind of, well, exploding it a little bit so that you can make even more half square triangles all at once. I often like to have a nice big stack of these just sitting next to my sewing machine because it's good mindless sewing. Once you've got your half square triangles, squares, all sewn together and stuck together, right sides again on the inside, you'll notice this is a really funny looking thing. It doesn't really look like much of anything. This is where the rotary cutting magic tends to happen. So the first thing that you want to do as a quilter is you want to stick that ruler and you want to line it up on those lines and start cutting, but that's not what we want to do actually. What we must do first is we must cut this into 4 equal sized segments. And what we want to do that is we want to cut this lengthwise and widthwise. So what we do is we use a clear quilting ruler and line it up to cut this shape in half lengthwise and widthwise. And depending on the size of your square, obviously that's going to impact what the half point is widthwise and lengthwise. And I trust you to do your handy dandy math to figure that out. Once you've done that, you're going to have a total of 4 squares. It's really easy to jar them, but after this step, it's really simple. If you do happen to jar them and scoot them around your table, all you're cutting on from this point forward are those lines. So just cut along those lines. And you have yourself 8 whopping half square triangles. Now, once you've done that, you're going to need to open up your half square triangles in order to press them and trim them. I'm a big fan of finger pressing, really when it comes to any part of quilting. I like to finger press for a couple of reasons. One being I'm a lazy quilter. I take shortcuts, I really do. I'm a shortcut kind of girl. Whatever I can do to make things faster, easier, better, I'm all for. And finger pressing is a great trick for a lot of different kinds of quilting, especially half square triangles. So what I do first is I always finger press all 8. And then once I've done that, then I can go ahead and give them a quick press. Now, comparing this to the electronic cutting method, one difference is that there's no trimming involved. Once you have finished sewing those 2 triangle shapes together, you're all done. You're ready to sew those units together into a finished block. You're good to go. With the 8-in-1 method, you do have some squaring up to do. As you have done your sewing, it's entirely possible that the layers have shifted somewhat, and it's entirely possible that you may have just a little bit of squaring up to do as a result of that. All right, so let's go ahead and trim one of these guys up. You're just going to use that 45-degree line that you see on any clear quilting ruler to trim up your half square triangle to size. You're going to trim off those dog ears so that they're not in your way when you're sewing your half square triangles together. And when you're sewing those half square triangles together, if you ever have trouble with that, the key to getting those guys together in a smooth fashion is to make sure that you line things up along the seam. And if you have any trouble, always use that basting stitch that you have on your machine to get those together nice and smooth. So that's half square triangles, easy peasy, you can do it.